Hey folks, and welcome to this webinar on the future of API building. We're going to tour the new Hasura v3. My name is Rob. I'm a senior engineer at Hasura. If you joined our community calls before, you've probably seen my face. Over in the chat, just let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to have a bit of an idea of who all we have on here and where all you're joining us from today. I'm going to go ahead and jump into a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing. We're really glad to have everybody here. We know that a lot of this content was viewed on our community call earlier. We've been trying to release a lot of information about what Hasura v3 is, terms like Hasura DDN, and talking about the future and the evolution of Hasura and what that means for all of you. On the call as well, we're going to have a couple of people. We have Zach right now from the community team that's going to be answering questions in the chat. And then Rahul, the product manager for V3, is going to be on in just a little bit and can answer questions in a lot more detail if you do have them. However, as we're going through things, if there's anything that we can go into more detail about or questions that you have, please go ahead and throw those questions in either the chat or the Q&A section of AirMeet over there on the right-hand side. Let me go ahead and give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about during this next probably 45 minutes or so. I don't think we'll use the entire hour just because the magic of Hasura is really powerful and allows us to move through developing an API incredibly quickly. What we want to do to start, though, is kind of set the stage. So I'm going to be talking about just how we view the state of API development in 2023 and a lot of the problems that exist with developing APIs in the modern day. From there, we'll go ahead and pivot a little bit and talk about how Hasura DDN solves a lot of these problems and removes friction for teams that are looking to build quickly and iteratively on their APIs and really wrangle all of their data into one place as opposed to being in these disparate microservices and APIs. We will take a first-person perspective and look at what the day-to-day life is like for somebody using Hasura with a new experience in V3. So we'll talk about different parts of our stack, like the new Hasura CLI, a VS Code extension that's fueled by LSP, and then Hasura DDN, so deploying globally and nearly instantly around the world. Final two things that we'll talk about. We've looked a lot so far leading into things about how V3 works and what this concept of a supergraph is, but we'll actually dive into a supergraph example in architecture. And we'll see some examples of doing things like bringing in business logic using TypeScript, so we can actually have functions that are a part of our API as well. And then finally, we'll talk about all the benefits that exist for developing and building your APIs this way, as opposed to what we're really starting to see is the antiquated way of building APIs. I think that Zach and I were talking about this a little earlier, and I made a comment on the community call a couple weeks back of, 6 months from now, my bet is we're going to be saying, how do we ever build APIs the old way? And when we look at things today, hopefully you get the same impression that you can really accelerate and unblock your teams to do some amazing things in terms of data ownership and in terms of API development. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk specifically about what the problems are with creating APIs in 2023. And I think it's helpful to kind of have a mental model in place and start to think of things from a hypothetical sense. So we're going to imagine this kind of 30,000 foot or 10,000 meter view of the data layer for what would be a pretty typical e-commerce application. And if we start to think about all the different components of data that are integrated within this single application, it's going to be living in a lot of different places, and it's going to be taking a lot of different forms. So it could be that we have some kind of relational database like Postgres for storing product information and maybe even user information as well. We had that user information possibly being a document database, so a little bit different. Maybe it's not, there's no SQL. We have a service that's in place for searching for products. We have a payment service as well for processing payments, think things like Stripe. We have a shipping service for fulfilling orders and then integrating with different providers that are out there for shipping things. And then maybe we have a vector database for storing user recommendations. And when we start to think about the construction of all of these different data sources, they all have their own APIs, they all have their own schemas, they all have their own ways of being abstracted on and brought into an application. And it can be incredibly difficult for teams, especially small teams, to be able to work through and manage all these different services. And then as we think about larger enterprise scale businesses, it can be difficult to work across all these different teams to control these different data sources and really own these individual pieces of the API itself. If we're trying to put this down to like a single problem statement, I think that this captures it pretty well. That there's been this sprawl of microservices that slowed down all of our productivity as developers, and it's made managing all of this data and then owning the different code that's responsible for exposing portions of an API incredibly difficult. And when we add all these pieces of friction in, it really prevents us as individual contributors, as teams, as organizations to iterate quickly and meet whatever key outcomes we have that are associated with our particular API or whatever the goals of our business are. That word sprawl, I think, is one that we can really focus on, because whether we're building these services ourselves or whether we're going and reaching for third-party SaaSes that are out there, because that's one of the great things about development in 2023 is how modularized things have become and really the commoditization of different parts of the stack itself. The sprawl makes it difficult because there are so many great solutions out there. And what we're trying to say is, hey, could we actually bring them into one particular umbrella? And the term that we're going to go ahead and start to kind of plant the seed with right now is we're calling this the data supergraph. So if we think about how Hasura solves this and how we bring in this concept of a data supergraph, this is really a diagram that kind of shows that 30,000 foot view that I had a second ago. So we can imagine across the top row here, we have all of the different really end user facing portions of whatever it is that we're working on, whether that be client applications for the actual customers themselves, public APIs that are consumable by anybody, or internal apps that are used, within the company or the organization for monitoring and doing work, whatever they may be. On the back end of things, right, we have all these disparate and different data sources that could be of, again, varying types. And we've either had to build our own APIs or microservices on top of that, or connect in with whatever it may be in terms of the service itself as a SaaS that's being able to offer that up. What we're trying to do is consolidate all of these into a particular umbrella. And again, we're calling that the supergraph. These subgraphs that we have here, and we can imagine these individual columns that we have being these particular either individual APIs or groups of related APIs that can be owned by individual teams. So things that are somewhat similar to each other. We want to give a high degree of ownership to those individual teams so that they can work on developing their portion of the graph without breaking anybody else's portion of the graph as well and causing the entire API to come down. So we'll look at ways that can be done when we actually jump into VS Code here in just a moment. We also don't think that you should be having to write your own APIs or microservices to be able to integrate these things into your application. We think that that should be taken care of out of the box. And we do that using a technique called data connectors. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to hasura.io/connectors, and you can go here yourself as well. And you can read a little bit more about the concept of a data connector and how they work. But you'll see that Hasura DDN automatically supports a series of available connectors already out of the box. And then we have a lot more in the pipeline coming soon as well. Today, we'll be looking at two. We'll be looking at our Postgres connector and our TypeScript connector. So we'll connect a Postgres database, very quick and easy by dropping in a connection string. And then we'll actually bring in a TypeScript file with some functions into our API using the TypeScript connector. This is incredibly powerful because what this means is that if you have any APIs that exist out there that you want to go ahead and bring in, making a simple fetch or whatever it may be using that function, you can automatically bring it in. So the example that we'll look at in a little bit when we're looking at our supergraph example is going to be taking particular portions of Stripe's API, and through the TypeScript connector, we'll just actually bring in that to our API and be able to make calls to it. So we'll take a look in just a moment at that. The third piece in all of this is the concept of maybe more time in the terminal than anywhere else, right? And we're trying to make sure that this is where you spend the majority of your time. I think my internet may have just jumped out there. So if anybody has a problem, let me know, but I think I'm back now. So I'm going to keep going. Let's see. So we want to spend as much time in our local development environment as possible, but we also want to be able to test and use these things globally and nearly instantly. So what we're going to look at is Hasura DDN, allowing us to have a local development experience. So I can make changes inside of my IDE, and then using our local development experience, we can instantly see those changes propagated to our API in a testing environment or a production environment online. Right. Not much change on this slide except for the diagram on the right. So I'm going to jump back one more time so we can see this old architecture that we have here. And we can see, the lines going in different places. Things are crisscrossing. It's difficult. It's complicated. What we're proposing, right, is this idea of using these connectors to bring in all these different services into one data supergraph that Hasura can help you have a single endpoint that you can use for your client applications, public APIs, and then those internal applications as well. So for especially the teams that are working on the front end portions of your stack, right, they have one API that they have to work from and everything just works. Additionally, from the back end of things, it makes the management and the code ownership of all these different portions of the API much more parsimonious, right? So let's take a look at what life is actually going to be like for users or for the developer experience. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into VS Code. So we're going to begin by using the new Hasura 3 CLI. And as you can see right now, no tricks up our sleeve. This is a completely empty directory that we have here. But I'm going to start typing in Hasura 3, init dir, and then I'm going to put a period, right? So all I'm doing is saying, hey, let's create a new project and let's do it in this current directory. The CLI is going to give me a couple of options to begin with. I can either create a new project or I can have an empty project. I'm going to create a new project because this is also going to create the companion project on Hasura DDN. So I'll be developing and working locally, and then I'll be testing and deploying my API to Hasura DDN pretty much instantly. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And right off the bat, we can see a few folders and files were created over here. And just for a quick view, this is what we have. You'll see a series of YAML files, and then we have HML. So YAML is going to be two files in particular. We have our Hasura.yaml, which is going to be our entry point for the project itself. And you'll notice that we have a project name that's already been dropped in here. This is going to be the project to which I'm deploying on Hasura DDN. We have a build profile, which is where we can come in and specifically talk about which resources need to be a part of a particular build. We can create different builds for staging environments, for production environments. We can even create builds based upon certain subgraphs within the supergraph itself. So if I want to test as a particular developer for one of my APIs or one portion of my API, I can do that here if I need to. You'll see that we have a subgraphs folder with a default folder built into it. So automatically the CLI has generated a default subgraph. If we're thinking kind of long-term about how this would work, if we're trying to build out different portions of our API, we would continue to create different folders inside of subgraphs for the different parts of our supergraph. So we'll look in a little bit later, like I said, at bringing the TypeScript connector with Stripe, and we'll look at that structure and see that our subgraph actually has three different, or our supergraph rather, has three different subgraphs within it, okay? We'll talk more about these folders for commands, data connectors, and models in just a moment because they'll become a little bit clearer as we start going through these next steps. The CLI makes it incredibly easy to go ahead and start scaffolding out and building different portions of what we have. So right now I have the metadata command with the add hub connector subcommand, and I'm naming this source PGDB. I'm telling it I want to put it in my default subgraph, and I'm passing in this Hasura Postgres connector. This ID flag here is going to be whatever connector we want to actually use to bring in our data source, and then I'm passing this URL. This is the connection string for this database. If you were to go to our Hasura io/docs/3.0, inside of our CLI getting started, you can actually find the same connection string. You can use this if you would like to because it's a read-only user on the DB. So if you don't have your own database that you want to try, you can go ahead and use ours as well. And this is just our e-commerce docs sample app that we have. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here, and we'll see a few things happen right off the bat. First off, this env file was created. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and create a Git repository here. I could add a git ignore, and I could add my env to that ignore, and I could commit all this to version control without being worried about my sensitive information, like my connection strings, being pushed to source control. We'll look as well inside of the subgraphs folder and inside of data connectors. We now have a folder with the same name that I passed earlier, which was PGDB. And then we have this HML file. HML stands for Hasura Metadata Language. It's our flavor of YAML, and it allows our VS Code extension to actually scaffold out our API for us. So let me jump over here to my notes real quick, and we're going to keep moving down this pattern. We have the ability to use a watch mode. So I'm going to do Hasura 3 watch, and then I'm going to pass the current directory. What watch allows us to do is make live changes and create what we call builds every time a change is made inside of our DB or inside of our API here. If you'll notice, this file is pretty empty right now, but the configuration that we have is really all that we need between the CLI and our VS Code extension to go ahead and scaffold out really our entire API. So I'm going to go ahead and run this real quick. And it's going to give me a warning saying, hey, this is going to be creating and applying builds. And we'll talk more about what that means in just a moment. So I'm going to say yes. And I want you to watch this file that we have open right now. And let's see what happens after this daemon starts up. All right, so a couple of things have happened right off the bat. You'll notice A, I've got a lot more content up here inside of this file, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But B, the output in the terminal down here is letting me know that, hey, a build was just created with some information about the project itself. I'm going to go ahead and grab this link, and I know it's going to open in the wrong window most likely, so give me a moment, and let me just actually copy it. A little harder when you're doing a webinar with all these folks on here to have the right windows open in the right place. And we'll give it a second to go ahead and load up here. And you'll notice that I've got nothing accessible inside of my API. For anybody that's used Hasura v4, this is the Graphical Explorer. It's the API tab in Hasura v2 if you're used to that. And this should look, again, somewhat familiar for anybody that's used GraphQL. The question, though, is why don't I have anything accessible over here on the Explorer? Well, while we've brought in our tables, so what happened here is Hasura was able to introspect our data source. So it went and read this connection string that was inside of this environment variable and went and found all the information that we need for our API from the Postgres database itself. And if I keep scrolling through, we're going to start to see these different tables in here. And we get this warning from our VS Code extension that's letting us know, hey, this has not been tracked yet. Now, I could go table by table if I wanted to, and track these as what we call models. So we can see this directory that we have right here. Or if you're lazy like me, I'm going to go ahead and just type Hasura here, and you'll see all the different options that we have for the VS Code extension. I'm going to say track all. It's going to ask me which data source I want to use. I'm going to say PGDB. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and log in because I should have done that before. And then let's try that one more time. We'll say track all. And we'll do it again, and there we go. We'll have a live demo. So if you notice what happened here, all of these files were added inside of my models directory. And what we've done is we've created individual files for each of the different models that we have based on tables in our database. Models are an open data domain specification or open DD spec concept that we have that allow you to create relationships between different tables or different sources of information across disparate data sources. For ease, I'm going to go ahead and close all these windows that I have open up here, all these tabs, and we're just going to look inside of the users.html file for a second and kind of take a tour of what we have here. So we have a kind of model, and we have all the different fields like created at, email, ID, so on and so forth. But we also have information like permissions. So right now we can see that the admin can do whatever they want and see whatever they want from models. If there are relationships, which they're already from that introspection based on foreign keys brought into my API, I can see them down here. Again, the terminal has the output down here for our new build. So if I come over here, remember there's nothing over in the Explorer, but if I hit refresh, I should see, again, if live demos work the way they always do, all of my different fields or types exposed for my GraphQL API, which means that I can go ahead and make a nice query across different types inside of my DB. And I should get the information over on the right-hand side, right? So we're querying our orders table, and from all the orders, we're getting the user's ID, name, and email, and then whatever products they ordered as well. So this is essentially a complete GraphQL API, but there may be some things that I would want to do inside of this users.html file, and I want to go ahead and iteratively test them and see how they work together. So I'm going to jump back in, again, thinking about the day-to-day life of a developer using Hasura DDN and V3. Inside of my users HML, I'm going to go ahead and find my model permissions. And for anybody that's used Hasura V2, this next part should feel pretty familiar of going ahead and creating your permissions for your API with just a few additions in this file, in this model permission section, and then in our type permission section that we'll see in a second, we can have a secure API that prevents people from accessing data they shouldn't be accessing. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. I'm going to come in and I'll say role. So I'm creating a new role here of user, and I'll go ahead and say select, and I'll say filter. And if I'm not sure what to do at any point, right, because we have the VS Code extension here that allows for auto completion, I can do Control and Spacebar on my keyboard, and it'll go ahead and let me know the different options that I have to be able to bring up. So I'll go ahead and say field comparison, and I want to say ID, and I'll tab down and we'll do underscore EQ, if I can actually tab. And then from there, we'll go ahead and say whatever the value is going to be. And I want to make it a session variable. And I'll say X Hasura user ID. All right, let's see if I can figure out what I've done here that's making it angry. That will make that happier, and then we'll bring that back one. Lovely. Now, as I save these changes, right, my API is being updated. So if I come back over and check a build out, let's make an easier query real quick. And actually, I'll refresh the screen real quick. And let's go ahead and let's just do a user's query. And I'll say ID and email. I just want these two pieces of information. So we'll go ahead and run this, and we get all the users being returned here. In my header up here, I'm going to go ahead and add X Hasura role, and I'm going to pass a user, which is that role that we just created. So if I click outside of that, you'll see a couple of things happen right off the bat. First off, we get some errors over here, which is not surprising. But on the left-hand side, my entire schema has transformed, right? All I have available are users, and I don't have any types or any fields that are accessible because I haven't actually exposed those yet. So if I come back over to VS Code, I'm going to find my type permissions. And this is the simple part. I'm just going to go ahead and select the ones that already exist for admin. I'm going to put role user here. And let's say a user should not be allowed to see when things were created, their email is verified, when they were last seen, or when it was updated. So we should only have 4 fields being accessible here. I'll go ahead and save. Our build has been triggered. I'm going to jump back over and give a refresh on this. And now I can make a query for ID of email, or user's ID and email. I'm getting an error here, though, because I haven't actually passed some information that I need. Well, if you remember earlier, we said that we could pass the user ID. So let me grab one of these UUIDs that I have over here. And if I paste this value in, I should now just get my own information coming back. So think about what this is like for front-end devs that are having to work with the API that you're constructing. They don't have to have separate queries that they're generating for admin or for user-specific queries, right? Just by changing which headers are passed as a part of that request, we're changing what information is returned. So just by turning these back on, we now have a secure API that only allows users to access their information from the API itself. All right. So to keep building off of all of this, I'm actually going to kill our watch command for just a second. And I'm going to introduce the ability to bring in custom business logic. So we're going to be bringing in things like a TypeScript connector that allow us to do, in the example that we're looking at, some pretty simple things, but then we'll look at some more complex examples, like I said, with Stripe, and bringing in really custom logic that allows us to do whatever we need to within our API itself. Let me go ahead and paste in this string so that we can all follow along with what's happening. We're using the metadata command again and the add hub connector subcommand. And I'm going to call this one TS logic. I'm going to put it on my default subgraph. And the connector that I'm passing through is the Hasura TypeScript Deno connector. So again, this is available out of the box for use. And this is probably my favorite part of this entire demo that we're doing today. You'll notice that the URL is localhost 8100. So what we're going to be able to do is make changes to that TypeScript file locally inside of our IDE. And then every time we make a change, when we save it, that change is going to be detected and it's going to be redeployed to our API on DDN. So anybody anywhere in the world that has access to that endpoint, whether it's a staging environment, whatever it may be, can go ahead and actually see what that testable code is like. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in. Keep things nice and neat. We'll bring Hasura Watch back up. We'll say yes. And we're going to go ahead and jump into our TS logic file. So you'll notice this is pretty similar to what we had when we connected our Postgres database. We have an HTML file that has an environment variable that, again, is pointing back to our ENV over here, which is localhost 8100. I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but you can actually deploy these connectors. So as TypeScript, you can deploy this connector to Hasura DDN yourself. So we will host this function for you, almost like a serverless function, essentially. Alternatively, though, if you want to host it on your own infrastructure, if you want to put it anywhere else, you can as well. But inside of this TS logic.html, you'll notice that as Watch started up, a few things have been added in here. So connectors themselves, including the TypeScript connector, have a schema endpoint. So when Watch started, that slash schema endpoint was hit, and we've gone in and found out some information about our function. Our function is just living inside of this index.ts file. We could put multiple functions in here if we wanted to, but for ease, we're going to keep it to one right now. And like before, you'll notice that we have this warning letting us know that hello is not being tracked. So if I do command and period, I can go ahead and do a quick fix and track it right there for myself. Get these things out of the way. Our new build was just created. So let's go ahead and go over to our API real quick. And I'm going to refresh. And we'll give it a second. And I'm going to do a mutation. And we're going to do hello, which looks like it's not coming through. So let me come back and let me see if I can make a change real quick inside of this just to kind of trigger a rebuild. We'll say hello, folks, and we'll give this a second. Well, let's come back over and do a refresh. And we're still not getting it there. Let me come back and see what I've missed, because I guarantee I've missed a step in this whole process. So we have this. Let's kill it, and let's bring it back Hasura 3 watch one more time, and I'll say yes. All right, we've got our procedure of hello there. So let me come back and see if our new build's coming up. Our tunnels are being generated for us. All this is being done under the hood to make our life easier. All right, lovely. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. And let's see if we get our hello. We don't right there, but that's okay. So what we can do is we're going through this, right? We can make these changes automatically. So as I do hello, folks, we could go ahead and be updating this in live and actually get those changes persisting on our API for us. What I want to do next, though, so we've talked a lot about, if I can find where I was. We've talked a lot about what things look like as a simple subgraph. But what I want to do next is actually take a look at a supergraph. No, I see somebody asking about Hasura role. That's not the problem. Or actually, you know what? You may be right. That is the problem. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. Hey, thank you, Nandor. Appreciate that. Always good in a live demo. So let's stick around here for just a second and look at what we have. So permissions work very clearly, right? Because if I have Hasura role set, then I'm not going to be able to have access to this mutation. But if I go ahead and run this, we get hello, folks. So let's jump over to our console or our terminal, and let's change this to hello, people. And I'm going to make a save, right? This was changed automatically. So let's come back in here and run this again. And now we get hello, people, right? So globally, instantly, we have access to that TypeScript function inside of our API. And again, always check your permissions. When I'm teaching people about Hasura, I always tell them, hey, from the front-end world, cores is always the problem. If you ever have a problem in Hasura, I guarantee it's your permissions that you've messed up. So thank you, Nandor, for being very vigilant. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead and jump over to looking at a supergraph in a bit more detail as well, though. I have this project, and you'll notice that actually, if I come back to the one that we've been using, this is the just PGDB and TS Logic. We have one subgraph called default. And these are all the different aspects of our Postgres database. And then we have our function for our TS Logic connector called hello. I can go and find out more information about each of these different things and have some pretty powerful tools in terms of like database management and visualization. But it doesn't really help to be looking at a single subgraph and kind of get the idea of how everything is connected. Where this really shines is the example that we have here, which is a supergraph. So if I just jump out for a second, we can see this is actually the same Postgres database that we have as a part of this API, just brought into this one. It's under default, but we have two others. So we have a billing API, which is also a Postgres relational database. And then we have this Stripe connector and the Strapi connector. Strapi is still under development. We're still working on that. But from Stripe, right, what I've done here is I've just brought in 3 different functions as a part of the Stripe API itself that I can actually use within my GraphQL API. So I'll show you what that means here. That means that in the front end portion of my application, right, if I wanted to go ahead, and anybody who's dealt with Stripe and dealt with checkout sessions knows how difficult it would be to kind of orchestrate all of this, I can actually go ahead and make a query directly in my API. So I can say get Stripe user by ID, and I can go ahead and pass in that value. and all get all the information returned about this particular ID. It's waking up right now, which is why it's slow. So we'll give it just a second. And then the next query that we'll make will have a lot more detail. So we see that this is all coming directly out of Stripe, but it's being returned as a portion of my API. So it's part of my super graph. If I go back here, I'm going to go ahead and do one for get checkout session. I'm going to run this, and we'll have an actual URL returned to us that we could use if we wanted to for a checkout session inside of Stripe. And you'll see, because we passed in the user ID, it's going ahead and identifying what the email address is, and then we can go ahead and make our purchase right here. So really removing those roadblocks and trying to make things as easy as possible for our end users. All right. I'm going to go ahead and jump back over. If I can find where the presentation has gone to this time. So hold callers. And there we go. So the questions may be sitting here of like, why is this a better or a more beneficial way of building an API? And what we can really say is that you have a single API, right? So for anybody that's from the front end world especially, only having one API to hit and not having to have all these different endpoints from the maintenance and the composability of having to keep up with all the versioning of a REST API, it's much better just to have this single GraphQL API example or available to all of your applications, all of your end users. We saw how quickly things worked inside of Hasura DDN, especially when we had the issue with the TypeScript connector. We have near instant builds, right? So this is all built on top of Rust. It's incredibly quick. And we can go ahead and iterate tremendously quickly compared to the old way of doing things and thinking about CI/CD pipelines and having to move from local to staging to development or to prod, so on and so forth. For anybody that's been in the situation before, right, this means you can quickly deploy things, but just as quickly, you can roll back if you need to by taking a previous build and moving back to that if you need to. This is globally deployed, so out of the box, right? Hasura DDN works all over the globe with different regions available. This makes for incredibly quick applications or end user experiences that really makes things delightful for everybody. We have a series of connectors, like we said, that we are actively working on in development. But from the example that I was looking at, I built up that one for Stripe for myself, for something that I was testing. You know, Stripe API is massive, so it would take quite a while to go ahead and create the connector that would work for that. Maybe I only need a few of the different endpoints or a few of the different portions from a particular API to be able to be brought in as part of my custom business logic. That's what the TS connector allows you to do. Really, anything that exists out there as an existing service, you could go ahead and bring in using this connector if you wanted to. And then finally, that local development experience, right? For all of us that really like sitting inside of our IDEs and not having to do anything else, we can be there the entire time if we want to. This allows me also to work with my team, though, and collaboratively build out my super graph together. Those different project folders that we had for those subgraphs themselves, they could be committed and live within different repositories for different parts of your stack for your application. So they don't have to all sit inside of just this one Hasura project folder that we have here. All right. Before I say try it yourself, I'm going to bring Rahul on stage just to see if there's anything that he would like to add. And then I know that he's over there on the side answering questions as well. So Rahul, I'm going to bring you up here real quick. Rahul, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Rob. Thank you for having me here, and thank you folks for joining the session.
Yeah, is there anything you want to add to what I've been going through?
No, I've been intrigued by your presentation so far. I think all good to go, and good to know that we troubleshooted that problem real quickly.
Thank you, Nandor. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. All right, cool. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and go to our next slide here. So if you folks want to go to hasura.io/DDN, you'll find information about how to get started. You can also go to hasura.io/docs/3.0, and you'll find all the information for getting started there as well. I will say there's a couple different routes that you can use to get started. One's a console first example. So for anybody that likes just to paste a connection string and go, you can do that. And literally within seconds, you'll have your API. But given the power that we've talked about for the collaborative experience and working inside of your local dev environment, we really recommend the CLI first approach. So do check that out. We'll stick around here for a second if there are any questions that have come through, and I'm just going to look over on the right-hand side in the Q&A section. So Rahul, we got a couple of questions. I'm just going to go ahead and bring them up and we can talk about them here. First one is, could we build another UI for the Hasura dashboard? I'm not quite sure what that means. We do like the improvements that we've had for the console itself. It's under active development. We have light mode, dark mode now. The visualizations are great. And despite the jokes that came up on the community call, you don't need a powerful GPU to be able to use those visualizations. So,
yeah. So the dashboard, are the people referring to the existing V2 monitoring dashboard, or is the question more around the new traces we are showcasing in V3?
let's see, Alexander, if you want to throw another question in there, just to kind of clarify what it is that you're asking, then we'll be happy to answer that the best that we can. While you're doing that, I'm going to keep working through the other questions that I see coming up here. One is, if we have a Postgres DB on AWS, is it possible to host Hasura on AWS so that the network requests don't take too long? Rahul, do you want to talk about latency a little bit and database location, all those things?
Yeah, so there will be two versions of DDN going forward. One version of the DDN, which will be multi-region by default. We'll be hosting it in the most optimal cloud provider, cloud region ourselves. And the more enterprise version of DDN would allow you to choose the cloud provider. And in that case, you will be able to then specify that I want Hasura multi-region to be deployed in an AWS so that I could have my AWS database talk to that. Apart from that, we're interested to see how much latency problems you are falling even with our public DDN offering. It is, let's say we have region-wise, it will be sorted. I think, yes, between cloud providers, there could be an issue, which we are happy to hear more about and provide a solution for. But definitely the more, I would say, advanced offering would give you the option to select a cloud provider of your choice. And there's a question here, Rob, if I can just jump to that on the chat. It's a little connected here, which is, will there be a self-hosted version of this new DDN V3 approach? So we are in the works of making V3 engine open source, and in fact, giving you a preview of some announcements in the coming few weeks, where you'll be able to host the data plane. Data plane means all the connectors and the V3 engine is open source and self-hosted. However, the build creation process, console, these will be managed by Hasura. So you could potentially host the V3 open source product in AWS and use our control plane to build metadata and then run it in a self-hosted approach. So long answer to this question, short answer to this question, yes, there will be a self-hosted open source version of DDN. But the developer experience, as you can understand, is a little different from V2. And stay geared for our open source release, and we are looking for contributions, and you'll be able to read through the code yourself on the V3 engine side. If Rob did not mention this already, all connectors are open source already, so that's something which we already have.
Yeah. Kind of related to that last question that we had there, there's one further up the chat here that says, I'm used to using the Hasura UI of old. Is this just a way of codifying or codifying the permissions instead of setting them through the UI? So to answer that question, Daniel, we're trying to not force people, right? But we really want to encourage and embrace that IDE first approach. And the console itself is really more for, kind of exploring your API itself. That being said, there will be parity between what you can do in the UI as to what you can do inside of the IDE. It's just going to take a little bit further down the roadmap for that to come about. But yes.
Permission builder is number one thing. It's my favorite part of the platform right now. So just think of this as that all the goodness you enjoy with permission builder right now, it will be the same in V3, if not better. Whether it's on the IDE or console is something which we're working on. The movement to IDE is just to make sure that the iteration loops are much faster. There's always a problem of managing state, metadata state, if you are on the console or local development. So we just wanted to optimize on local development and use console for visualization, troubleshooting, stuff like that.
Awesome. Looking back on the Q&A real quick, we got a few more that have come through. Rahul, we say, let's see. So this is the follow-up from the dashboard question about the UI. So Alexander says, custom front-end dashboard. So the current front-end is well modularized to integrate third parties client as dashboard.
Where is this clarification in the Q&A section?
It is. It's about halfway down the list of choices that we have there.
Custom front-end dashboard. So I see. I think there are two parts to this question. First of all, there will be APIs fronted in DDN, so you could create any dashboard in any tool of your choice. Now, whether you could host it on the cloud console, I think that's not on the roadmap yet. Like the console is not modularized to that sense where you could have a custom console out there, including your dashboards. So that's not on the roadmap yet, I would say. We are, it's modularized enough that we are using certain third parties behind the scene for console development, but not for someone like you to kind of have a custom console out there, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But thanks for the feedback. I think this is all great. Right now, it's not on the roadmap.
I see a question about connector implementations and how they look, and will there be a way to create custom connectors? So yes, we have 2 SDKs. You can find out more about both of those on hasura.io/connectors. One SDK is in Rust, one is in TypeScript, and we have information in the docs there as well. So for example, if there's a connector that doesn't exist that you're really eager to have, you can also build it yourself and then share it with the community. We have a verification process as well where we'll go through and make sure that the connector meets all the different criteria, and then it'll be deployable as needed.
In fact, on that note, we have a whole learn course, kind of a very early stages learn course for you to build your own connector. But if you complete the steps here, you'll have a SQLite connector running on your local machine, which you can use with DDN. And when it comes to deployment, we will also make like you could host the connector yourself and bring a URL to DDN, or you could use Hasura CLI to deploy a custom connector. The ones which are like the strategic ones like Postgres, going forward MongoDB, those connectors you don't have to build or deploy. They will be as part of the platform, similar to the kind of experience you have in V2.
Yep, I see a couple of things in here about the UI and dark mode. Yes, V3 has, Hasura DDN has dark mode across the front end portion of the application itself. So anywhere that you're in there, you should see dark mode as an option.
Your demo was not in dark mode, Rob?
I'm a peculiar person. I do it based on time of day. That's what my system settings are. But hey, if we want it, there we go. Okay, my eyes are calm now. Yeah, fine.
We have.
What else we have, Rahul?
Sure. Let's go through questions and please feel free to like I'm open to hang out after the designated hour as well.
I see one about IoT protocols on the Q&A section.
Let's go there.
Third from the bottom.
So MQTT is just. So do you have an API which is MQTT based and you want to bring the data into the supergraph? If that is the requirement, then it could be done via TypeScript connector right now. Like you could build a TypeScript wrapper function to talk to an MQTT protocol and use a TypeScript connector to bring MQTT protocols into Hasura. So I believe that is currently possible based on, and we're going to enhance TypeScript support. So if there's a library which we cannot import right now from the NPM ecosystem, you could do that in the coming weeks. Going forward, we can definitely, either you, the community, can build MQTT specific connectors using the NDC Learn course, or we could ourselves invest in creating more MQTT based connectivity options. So there are like these 2-3 options right now, but I believe you can do a prototype right now with MQTT. Nothing is stopping you, unless I'm understanding this incorrectly, which you can clarify or maybe reach out to us later.
And just to maybe expand on that a little bit, since we're talking about the TypeScript connector, there's a lot of us within the company that have been talking about what doors this opens. So Rahul, can you just kind of give us like a little TLDR of like, what can we really do with the TypeScript connector? Like, what does it unlock for us?
Yes, so I think there are two motivations behind the TypeScript connector. First of all, I think in V2 actions was a way to bring in business logic or to integrate with an API is a very popular feature. In fact, there are users, including me, who cannot use Hasura without actions because we need to have business logic as part of a graph. However, the V2 actions experience was not optimal. You had to develop the backend yourself, bring the webhook URL, host it somewhere, then use our own templating language to convert it into custom types, and then have a GraphQL API out there. So there a lot of feedback we received on the V2 actions experience that helped us move into this direction to kind of why not embrace uh, programming language ecosystem as it is without having you to learn new things or host things in other platforms. So the whole idea behind the TypeScript connector is going towards this movement of bringing in programming languages as a first-class citizen in the Hasura ecosystem. We are starting with TypeScript, but you could have the same experience with Java, Go going forward. And the whole idea is that if you're a TypeScript developer or a Java developer, you just write your business logic in that programming language. You get the ability to host that within the Hasura platform, and uh, that just makes the experience even better and improves the flexibility of the platform. Those were the kind of the primary motivations behind the scene, is that um not ask people and users to kind of learn a new language or a new way to uh, write or bring in business logic.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a question that I see in the Q&A that's, since we were talking about actions in V2 and kind of transitioning over to V3, this is somewhat similar. So I'll just read it for everybody so that we know what we're talking about, and then I'll take a stab at answering the beginning of it. Rahul, you can help fill in any gaps that I have there. So the question comes up about, customers that use Hasura, do they implement their own authentication system and use that JOT in the Hasura calls, or are they using a third party? And if so, what's the most popular auth-in service provider they like to use? So just like in V2, right, you have the option of using JOTs or webhooks. Out of the box, we provide an auth configuration object. So I'm going to actually jump over to VS Code. And if I look inside of Supergraph, I have this auth config file. We give you a webhook out of the box that you can use with Hasura DDN. So if you want to test and see how things work, you can go ahead and use that right there. Go ahead and make calls, easy peasy. However, you can use your own third-party service. You can set your secret just like you did in V2 for JOTs or access webhooks, whatever they may be. In terms of popularity, we get a lot of hits on the auth0 page inside of Docs around setting that up with regards to JOTs in particular. But Rahul, anything that I left off, go ahead and jump in there.
Yes, the question is most popular mechanism. I would say auth0 is definitely popular, but any other IDP out there, there's a whole spectrum of IDPs that people use, and the preferred way is that you do your authentication integration with the third IDP, bring that JOT here, and once the JOT is resolving into a user session, then you use Hasura Magic to do authorization, basically.
Yep, and the JOT approach is tremendously favored over the webhook approach in terms of users that we've seen, in terms of quantity. All right, let's see. A little bit of feedback for us there, Rahul. We could add a better prettying of the GraphQL query in the admin API section. The current one is not great. Compare it with free Altair GraphQL client. So we could have a more pleasurable experience on the UI itself, we're being told.
Thank you, Jaroslav. Yeah, Altair is my favorite client as well. Yeah, a lot we can do on graphical. I don't know if you've used V2 graphical. I think it's a little bit more slick, the V3 graphical at least, and we'll make it. Thanks for the feedback. Yes.
Yeah.
History also could be better, but we could definitely look into Prettify first. Cool. Let's see what other questions people have. And if we have, there was one on the chat around
gRPC
connection implement. How does a connection implementation look like? Can we create? There was a custom connector development question, right?
Yep, we've already answered that one.
Sure. Yeah, let's go with more.
There's one new one that just came through. Can you talk a little bit about V3 and Hasura Cloud? So maybe a bit of clarification as to what the evolution of Hasura Cloud is, kind of terminology, DDN, V3, so we understand these different pieces and how they fit together.
Yeah, DDN is basically V3 on cloud. So the open source engine and the connectors, they constitute V3. Engine is going to be open source in a few weeks. But when you went through the console and the CLI, in the CLI, the first step is Hasura 3 login, and then you're creating builds and all of that. That's happening via the Hasura Cloud platform. And that's what we call Data Delivery Network in the new incarnation.
Good deal. We'll hang out here for another minute. Some more questions come through, but that's the latest one that I've seen.
So I think let's. Are there any other plans for other IDE plugins like IDEA or Eclipse? So I will set up a GitHub issue for this very soon so that you could put the list of all the IDs out there, because in the last community call, there was a request on WebStorm.
And NeoVim, please.
Yes. So short answer, yes. There are plans for plugins for all IDEs. Now, which one's going to come first? That will depend on prioritization. But yes, VS Code is the prototype for what's about to come. If we have a Postgres DB on AWS, we talked about that. Printing GraphQL query done.
So there's one about migration from Cloud 2 to 3, or just migration of V2 projects to V3 projects. Maybe it would be a better, kind of broader way of talking about it.
Yes. So if you're a V2 customer, please be rest assured no forceful migration or upgrade is happening to you. This is all different cloud platforms, so these projects are untouched. What we will provide you is a migration utility or a bridge in January timeframe, where it would be few clicks or maybe one click approach to just migrate your V2 project into the V3 metadata. And you can choose to still work with V2 or gradually move your production workload to V3. Your V2 projects will still remain the same. And we'll provide a migration utility for you to move to V3.
Kind of more in the realm of V2 and V3, we have a question or a comment here about how it'd be nice if Hasura could reload DB introspection. I've got good news. You can do that automatically in the LSP already, right? So with the Hasura commands that we have here, we have an option for refresh data connector. So if I make changes to my underlying source, if I modify tables, whatever it may be in my Postgres database, I can just refresh that directly inside of the DB or inside of my IDE, and those changes for the schema introspection will be picked up and added here as well. So that happens automatically, or not automatically, but it's easy to do here. Question about migrations via Django as an example. Do you want to talk a little bit about how migrations, like the role that migrations play in V3, since that's a little bit different than it was in V2, Rahul?
Yeah, so in V2, we support migrations for Postgres mainly. And in V3, we are thinking or strongly thinking about deprecating migrations. Right now, we don't have migrations in the alpha product at least. And the reasoning behind it is that we just cannot do a good job for each database out there in terms of migration. And we are seeing our community grow out of Postgres now into all different types of databases. So our point of view there is that we'll give you a generated SQL, which you could maybe use in a different ORM of your choice, like Flyway and things like that, and do all migration of databases outside of Hasura. That might be a little change for current V2 users on migrations. We are happy to hear any thoughts on that strategy, but right now that's what we are thinking.
Let's see.
There are questions around gRPC, so I just want to say that.
Yeah, please.
gRPC, there are two requests on gRPC. One is outputting gRPC messages or protobuf kind of format for the API. That's on the roadmap. So you will be able to generate and talk to your clients in gRPC from Hasura. The timeline of it I'll share on GitHub in the weeks or months to come. And on the other end, also importing gRPC APIs into the Supergraph. That can happen via connectors. Right now, it's a code-intensive procedure for you to write a TypeScript function to map a gRPC API. It's also not straightforward. So we'll make that experience better. I believe the requests are coming more on the output side and not the input side, but output side, definitely, yes. Input side into the Supergraph, we are evaluating priority on making that easy to do. Our first goal on the input side is to make sure API integration is open API integration is very seamless.
So I think we have time for probably one more question, and it's there's a new one that was just added inside of the Q&A section. It says, "Does the new version of DB introspection includes simpler updates to enums?" So I'm not familiar with this, Rahul. If you could help us out.
Yeah, so update to enums would be if your question is in a different way, can I roll out without breaking changes with update to enums? Then I think yes, this is a better experience. But if I did not answer that correctly, I'm happy to know your more feedback on this and I'll get back to you. But as I understand, like if you change your enums, your API will change and it might cause breaking change in V2. So which would be because of the build system and the atomic builds, you'll be able to do that more gracefully in V3.
Yep.
And there is an enum support, which like enum is. So if I'm not understanding this correctly, there was a question in the last community call around enums, and we're working on certain features around that as well in the time to come. So when will V3 be available? It is available right now. In fact, didn't we share the docs links with folks right now? We could do that real quickly. Or did you do that, Rob, yet?
I have not yet, but while you're doing that, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have come through. So yes, V3 is available right now. You folks can try it out. The link that I have on the screen is just kind of a nice landing point for you. When you click the Get Started button on there, it'll take you to the docs. And you can go through the information. Daniel, you asked about the Learn tutorial. You can definitely use that because we go into a lot of detail, kind of explaining really a lot of what's happened here today, going through the different pieces. And it also covers the local dev experience. So if you were to go to the doc site, we have that getting started from the CLI. That's what's being used inside that Learn course as well.
And Danny did provide more flavor on his enum question. So that's a great idea. I think nothing on the immediate roadmap, but we can definitely look into that.
Cool. If you folks do have more questions, I'm going to jump over. Please reach out to us on Discord. Rahul and I spend a lot of time sitting there going through and looking through the different conversations that have happened. We'd love to connect with you and have more conversation. So yeah, let us know your thoughts. We look forward to seeing you folks online and seeing what you build with Hasura. And thanks so much for coming today. Rahul, thank you for being here.
Thank you for joining, everyone. And we'll have more of these. We'll have office hours. Please hang out on Discord, DDN Alpha channel on Discord. We are there to answer questions and help you on this journey. Thank you for using the platform.
And Nandor, thank you again for catching my permission, or my role there. I appreciate that. Bye, folks.